The father returned from the army and witnessed his daughter eating dog food. What she said froze his heart. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Lucas dropped his duffel bag, boots still caked with distant mud, when he heard the metallic scrape echo from the kitchen. The stench of spoiled food and wet fur hit him like a punch. But nothing compared to the shock of seeing his little Emma, knees on the grimy tile, shoveling dry kibbles from a dented bowl into her mouth. He froze, heart pounding in his chest, unable to move or speak. Emma didn't even look up, her face blank, her golden curls tangled and streaked with dirt. It was the stillness in her eyes, not tears, that shattered Lucas more than any explosion he'd survived on the battlefield. "Emma," he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper that barely carried across the kitchen. 15 months. That's how long he'd been gone. 15 months of video calls that grew increasingly shorter and less frequent. 15 months of his daughter's voice changing, growing distant. But nothing had prepared him for this. The little girl slowly turned her head, kibble crumbs clinging to her chin. She looked thinner than he remembered, her once rosy cheeks now hollow. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but no joy followed it. "Daddy," she said, her voice small and uncertain, as if addressing a stranger. Lucas took a tentative step forward, then another. The kitchen floor was littered with empty cans and take-out containers. A stack of unwashed dishes teetered in the sink. Where was Sarah? His wife had promised everything was fine during their last call 3 weeks ago. "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" Lucas knelt beside her, fighting the urge to snatch the dog food away. "Where's Mommy?" Emma's gaze drifted back to the bowl. "Mommy's sleeping again," she said it matter-of-factly, with the resignation of someone who'd grown accustomed to disappointment. "She sleeps a lot now." Lucas felt a cold dread spreading through his chest. "And why are you eating this?" "There's nothing else," Emma shrugged, reaching for another handful. "And I got hungry waiting. Rex doesn't mind sharing." As if summoned, their old Labrador padded into the kitchen, ribs visible beneath his dull coat. The dog approached Lucas cautiously, sniffing at his uniform before offering a half-hearted wag. "How long has Mommy been sleeping?" Lucas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Emma considered this, her small brow furrowing. "Since yesterday, I think. The TV's been on the whole time." Lucas swallowed hard, fighting back the rage and guilt threatening to overwhelm him. He gently took the bowl from Emma's hands and set it aside. "I'm home now," he whispered, pulling his daughter into an embrace that she didn't immediately return. "And I'm not going anywhere." Lucas dropped to his knees, reaching for her with trembling hands, but Emma flinched, curling away as if expecting a blow. For a moment, he saw not his daughter, but a wounded creature, every muscle taut with silent alarm. The realization cut deeper than any shrapnel he'd faced in combat. This wasn't the little girl who used to climb into his lap for bedtime stories, whose laughter once filled every corner of their home. "Emma, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "It's me, it's Dad." He tried to gather her into his arms, voice breaking as he whispered her name again. Emma allowed her head to rest on his shoulder, but her arms hung limp, her body stiff and untrusting. The suffocating silence between them was heavier than any burden he'd carried overseas. 3 years of missed birthdays, school plays, and everyday moments stretched between them like an uncrossable chasm. "I'm not going to hurt you," Lucas said, fighting back tears. "I would never hurt you." Her small body trembled against his chest. He could feel her ribs through the thin fabric of her shirt. Had she always been this fragile, this small? The military had trained him to assess situations quickly, to identify threats and neutralize them, but nothing had prepared him for this. No amount of combat training could help him navigate the battlefield of his daughter's broken trust. "Where's Mom?" he asked gently, trying to keep his voice steady. Emma's eyes darted toward the hallway, then back to the floor. "Working," she mumbled, The first word she'd spoken since he'd arrived. Always working. Lucas nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. Sarah had mentioned picking up extra shifts at the hospital in their infrequent video calls. But he'd never imagined things had gotten this bad. The state of the apartment, Emma's behavior, the dog food. It all pointed to neglect that had been festering in his absence. "When did you last have a proper meal?" he asked, keeping his tone conversational despite the rage building inside him. Emma shrugged, her eyes still fixed on the floor. "Yesterday, maybe. The food stamps ran out. Rex always has food." Lucas felt his heart fracture. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, followed by the jingling of keys. Sarah was home. He drew a deep breath, steadying himself for the confrontation to come. "Emma, where's Aunt Rachel? How long have you been here alone?" His questions tumbled out, desperate, but she just stared at the floor, eyes hollow, stomach growling in the quiet. Lucas knelt before his daughter, gently lifting her chin with his trembling hand. Her cheeks were sunken, smudged with dirt, and her once vibrant eyes looked vacant. The silence between them felt heavier than any rucksack he'd carried during his 15 months of deployment. "Daddy," she finally whispered, her voice cracking from disuse. "Auntie Rachel left 4 days ago. She said she'd be back soon." Emma's tiny fingers clutched at the hem of her stained nightgown, which Lucas realized with horror was the same one she'd been wearing in their last video call nearly 2 weeks ago. Lucas's frustration threatened to boil over. He wanted to scream, to break something, but he forced himself to breathe. He lifted Emma, cradling her tightly, and carried her to the battered couch. He wrapped her in the faded blanket that still held a trace of her mother's perfume. The familiar scent seemed to comfort Emma as she nestled against his chest, her small body far too light in his arms. "I tried calling you," she murmured into his shirt. "The phone wouldn't work. Then the lights went away too." Lucas glanced at the darkened corners of the apartment, noticing for the first time the collection of candle stubs on the coffee table. The bills must have gone unpaid for weeks. His sister Rachel had promised to care for Emma while he served his country, had sworn on their dead mother's grave that his daughter would be safe. Yet here was his precious girl, abandoned and starving, reduced to eating dog food to survive. "I'm so sorry, baby," he whispered, kissing the top of her head, his tears falling into her tangled hair. "I'm never leaving you again." The promise felt inadequate against the magnitude of his failure to protect her, but it was all he could offer in this moment. Emma's eyelids fluttered as exhaustion overtook her. "Are you real this time?" she asked sleepily. "Or is this another dream?" The question shattered what remained of Lucas's composure. How many nights had she dreamed of his return while fighting to survive alone? He held her closer, feeling her heartbeat against his own. "I'm real, Emma. I'm home for good." The kitchen was a disaster zone that made Lucas's military barracks look pristine by comparison. Towers of dirty dishes teetered precariously in the sink and on every available surface, crusted with the remnants of whatever meager meals had been prepared days or perhaps weeks ago. The windows had been sealed with duct tape around their edges, as if Emma had been trying to keep something out, or perhaps trap something in. The musty air hung heavy with neglect. Most disturbing was the fridge, its cord dangling uselessly from the outlet, the door slightly ajar and releasing a putrid stench of spoiled food that made Lucas instinctively cover his nose. Beside the refrigerator sat Buddy's bowl, nearly empty save for a few scattered kibble pieces, next to a cloudy puddle of water that had collected dust around its edges. "Emma!" Lucas called out again, his voice catching in his throat as he pulled open the pantry door, hinges squeaking in protest. What he found inside hollowed him out completely. The shelves that should have been stocked with food were barren except for the most pitiful remains. A half-empty, stale pack of saltine crackers with the plastic torn haphazardly, scattered grains of rice that had spilled from a toppled container, and empty cans lined up neatly as if someone had been saving them for a purpose he couldn't fathom. He picked up one can, noting the dried residue inside, dog food. His daughter had been scraping every last morsel from these containers. The reality gutted him more effectively than any combat knife could have. Emma hadn't just been eating dog food in some bizarre childhood phase. She had been surviving on whatever scrap she could find, sharing what little there was with Buddy. Where was the dog now? The question flashed through his mind alongside a parade of horrific possibilities. His knees nearly buckled as he pieced together what must have happened during his absence. His daughter, his little girl, had been abandoned to fend for herself, reduced to fighting hunger with whatever means available. "What happened here?" he whispered to the empty kitchen, running his hand through his military-cut hair. The silence that answered him was deafening. Lucas felt a cold rage building inside him, directed at his ex-wife, at himself, at the system that had somehow allowed this to happen. He needed to find Emma, to understand the full scope of what she'd endured, and then he needed to make this right. When Lucas returned to the living room, Emma watched him warily, eyes tracking his every move like a small animal assessing a potential threat. Her thin shoulders remained tense, hands folded tightly in her lap. He approached slowly, extending a bottle of water and a slightly bruised banana he'd carried all the way from the base. "Here," he said softly. "This might be better than what you were eating before." Emma accepted his offerings with cautious hands. She unscrewed the water bottle methodically, taking measured sips rather than gulping despite her obvious thirst. The banana disappeared in small, deliberate bites, not frantically, but with purpose, as if even now she was rationing, uncertain when food might come again. "Were you here all by yourself?" Lucas asked gently, keeping his distance on the opposite chair, trying not to overwhelm her. Emma nodded, her eyes downcast. After a long moment, she whispered, "Aunt Rachel said she'd come back, but she never did." The words hung in the stale air between them, heavy with abandonment. Lucas felt his jaw tighten. He remembered Rachel's promises from months ago, her voice cheerful over the phone. "Don't worry about a thing, big brother. Emma and I will have the best time. You just focus on finishing your service." He'd believed her, trusted his own sister with his most precious responsibility. "How long has Aunt Rachel been gone?" he asked, working to keep his voice neutral. Emma's small fingers traced invisible patterns on her knee. 23 days, she answered with unsettling precision. "She said just overnight, for a party." Lucas closed his eyes briefly, fighting to control the rage building inside him. 23 days. His daughter had been alone for over 3 weeks. The dog food, the locked doors, the desperate measures, it all made horrifying sense now. "Did she leave you any food, any money?" he asked. Emma shook her head. "The food ran out after 1 week. I tried calling her, but her phone doesn't work anymore." Her voice remained eerily calm, as if recounting someone else's hardship rather than her own. "And nobody came to check on you? No neighbors or friends?" "Aunt Rachel told me not to answer the door for anyone," Emma replied. She said it wasn't safe. The irony of that instruction wasn't lost on Lucas. His sister had abandoned his 8-year-old daughter, leaving her in far greater danger than any stranger at the door might have posed. "Did you call anyone? Did you go outside?" Lucas pressed, voice barely steady. His fingers gripped the edge of the kitchen table so tightly his knuckles turned white. The military training that had prepared him for combat zones hadn't prepared him for this, finding his daughter reduced to eating dog food. The phone stopped working. "I was scared to leave," Emma murmured, voice breaking. Her thin shoulders trembled beneath the oversized sweater. "There was a man shouting in the street, and the lights went out." She wiped her nose with her sleeve, eyes downcast. "It was like those blackouts they warned about on TV." She confessed she'd barricaded the door with chairs, terrified that the monsters from the TV news would come for her. The monsters. Lucas knew she meant the looters. and desperate people shown on the news during the economic crisis. His daughter had been watching too much sensationalist coverage before everything fell apart. "I tried calling Aunt Sarah first," Emma continued, her voice small. But the line was just this weird beeping sound. Then I tried Mrs. Peterson next door, but nobody answered when I knocked." Fresh tears welled in her eyes. "After 3 days, I couldn't hear anybody outside anymore." Lucas's chest burned with guilt, each word a fresh wound. He should have been here. He should have found a way to get discharged earlier, when the first reports of civil unrest reached his unit. Instead, he'd trusted Sarah to look after Emma as promised. "But the food started running out last week," Emma whispered. "I tried making it last, eating just a little bit each day like you taught me." Her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. "When there was nothing left in the pantry, I found Rex's food in the garage." Lucas swallowed hard, fighting back his own tears. His brave little girl had survived alone for nearly 3 weeks in a neighborhood that had apparently descended into chaos. While he'd been serving his country, his daughter had been abandoned, forgotten. "You did good, sweetheart," he managed to say, reaching across to take her small hand in his. "You survived. That's what matters." But inside, rage was building. At Sarah, at his commanding officers who delayed his emergency leave, at himself most of all. "Are they coming back?" Emma asked suddenly, her eyes wide with fear. "The monsters!" Lucas squeezed her hand. "No, baby, I'm home now, and I'm not going anywhere." That night, Emma fell asleep in his lap, her small body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Lucas watched her chest rise and fall with each breath, her face peaceful for the first time since he'd arrived home. The weight of her trust pressed against him like a physical thing. He didn't dare move, even as his leg went numb and his back ached from the awkward position on the worn couch. This discomfort was nothing compared to what she had endured. As the hours crept by, Lucas remained awake, tormented by vivid images of his daughter in the dark, alone and hungry, whispering to her tattered teddy bear for comfort. Had she cried herself to sleep on those countless nights? Had she believed he'd abandoned her? The questions clawed at his mind, leaving wounds deeper than any he'd suffered in combat. His eyes drifted to the coffee table, where Emma's belongings lay scattered. Among them, he spotted a crumpled piece of paper. Carefully, so as not to disturb his sleeping daughter, he reached for it. As he smoothed out the wrinkles, his breath caught in his throat. 2 crude stick figures stood side by side, holding hands, one tall, wearing a green uniform, one small, with pigtails. Both had exaggerated smiles that stretched across their circular faces. A table between them overflowed with colorful scribbles representing food, a feast in a child's imagination. Below the drawing, in wobbly letters that slanted across the page, "Today is the day Daddy comes home." The date in the corner was from 3 weeks ago. Lucas pressed his lips together, fighting the burning sensation behind his eyes. She had been counting the days, preparing for his return, while he'd been delayed by paperwork and debriefings. The hope in those childish letters threatened to shatter him completely. He'd failed her in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. Gently, he brushed a strand of hair from Emma's forehead. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, he would start making things right. He would call his commanding officer about emergency leave extension. He would contact social services about his sister-in-law. He would fill the refrigerator with proper food. But tonight he simply held his daughter, guarding her sleep as if it were the most important mission he'd ever been assigned. Because it was. The military had taught him to protect his country. But nothing had prepared him for this, protecting the broken heart of his little girl. The drawing was old, he realized. The crayon marks dulled and the paper slightly yellowed at the edges. Emma hadn't just made this yesterday. She had drawn it weeks ago, perhaps even months. His throat tightened as the truth hit him. His daughter had been waiting for him all this time, faithfully drawing pictures of his return, clinging to the belief that her daddy would come home to her. She had sat at this very table, tongue between her teeth in concentration, as she colored his uniform the perfect shade of green, carefully adding his smile, because that's how she wanted to remember him. And then she had taped it to the refrigerator, a daily reminder of her hope. How many mornings had she woken up thinking, maybe today is the day Daddy comes home? How many nights had she gone to bed disappointed? Lucas carefully placed the drawing on the kitchen counter, his hands trembling slightly. At some point, Emma's hope must have faded into numb resignation, the kind that makes a child stop asking questions, stop expecting miracles, the kind that makes them accept eating dog food because maybe that's just how life is now. The thought made him physically ill. He barely slept that night, tossing and turning on the living room couch. The house creaked and settled around him, unfamiliar yet hauntingly familiar. Emma's soft breathing from the bedroom was the only thing that anchored him to reality. When the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, Lucas knew exactly what he had to do. No more missions, no more deployments, no more excuses. His daughter needed him more than his country did right now. He made a quick call to his commanding officer, requesting emergency family leave. Then he started making a list of everyone who might know Rachel's whereabouts. His ex-wife had some explaining to do, and he wasn't going to rest until he found her. What kind of mother leaves her child alone like this? What kind of mother doesn't ensure her daughter is properly fed? The anger building inside him was different from battlefield rage. It was cold, focused, and intensely personal. "I'm going to find Rachel," he whispered to himself as he watched Emma sleep. Her tiny frame curled around a tattered stuffed rabbit. "And I'm going to demand answers for what happened to my little girl." He gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Whatever explanation Rachel had, it better be good. Because right now, Lucas couldn't imagine anything that would justify what he'd come home to find. He left Emma sleeping, clutching her teddy, and walked through the sleepy streets of their small town. The world moved in slow motion around him. The sweet scent of fresh bread wafted from the local bakery, mingling with the heavy weight of regret that sat on his shoulders. Buses rolled past, nearly empty this early in the morning, their engines humming a melancholy tune that matched his mood. Lucas caught glimpses of himself in shop windows, a hollow-eyed stranger staring back, a man he barely recognized anymore. At the corner, he found an old payphone, one of the few left in town. His fingers trembled as he inserted coins and dialed Rachel's number. The dial tone droned on endlessly before switching to voicemail. He hung up and tried again, and again. On the fourth attempt, the ringing stopped abruptly. "Hello?" A shaky voice answered, barely audible. "Rachel, it's me." His voice caught in his throat. Silence stretched between them, years of unspoken words and broken promises filling the void. Then came a sob from the other end. "Forgive me." "Lucas," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I lost everything. I panicked. I failed you both." Lucas leaned his forehead against the cool metal of the payphone booth. "Where are you? What happened?" "After you left for deployment, things fell apart so quickly," Rachel continued, words tumbling out between quiet sobs. "The gambling started small, just a distraction from the loneliness. Then it became an escape. Before I knew it, I'd lost our savings. Maxed out credit cards, took loans I couldn't repay." Lucas closed his eyes, remembering the foreclosure notice, the empty cupboards, Emma's thin frame. The debt collectors were threatening me. I was scared they'd take Emma away if they knew how bad things were. So I ran. I thought my sister would help us get back on our feet, but she's barely managing herself. And Emma, you just left her alone." Lucas struggled to keep his voice steady. "I called Mrs. Peterson next door. I told her I had an emergency and would be back that evening." Rachel's voice grew smaller. "I never meant to stay away this long. I was going to fix everything first. I swear, Lucas, I never thought she'd be alone for more than a few hours." Lucas's face hardened as he pressed Rachel for answers, his voice strained with barely contained emotion. "How could you let this happen? How could you just leave her?" Each word felt like a stone in his throat. Anger and profound sorrow battling for dominance. Rachel's shoulders slumped as tears streamed down her face. "I lost my job 3 months ago," she whispered. "The company downsized without warning. I thought I'd find something quickly, but nothing came through." Her voice cracked. The bills kept coming. Rent, utilities, food, everything piled up until I couldn't breathe. "You could have called me," Lucas said, his fists clenching. "My parents, anyone. The shame was—" Rachel shook her head. "I couldn't admit I'd failed her. Failed us. I kept telling myself I'd fix it tomorrow, just one more day, and I'd figure something out." She wiped her eyes. "Then the eviction notice came, and I broke. Something inside me just snapped. I convinced myself Emma would be better off without me dragging her down." Lucas stared at her, unable to reconcile the woman before him with the person he'd once loved. "So you ran?" "I ran," she admitted, her voice hollow. "God help me, I ran." The drive home passed in a blur, Lucas's mind racing with everything he'd learned. He'd thought war had shown him the depths of human suffering, but this was a different kind of battlefield. When he arrived, Emma was awake, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor. She was colouring intently, her small tongue poking out in concentration. She looked up when he entered, offering a tentative smile. "I made another picture," she said, holding up her artwork. Lucas knelt beside her, studying the crayon drawing. It showed a house with an open window, sunshine streaming in. On a table sat a bowl of colourful fruit. 3 figures stood hand in hand, a tall man, a woman with long hair, and a small girl between them. All had exaggerated smiles on their faces, his heart constricted painfully. This wasn't a memory, it was a wish. A dream that had never been reality. How long had she carried this image in her heart? "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he managed, his voice thick. Emma beamed, adding a final yellow streak to the sun. "It's us," she said simply, as if stating an obvious fact. "When we're all better." Lucas swallowed hard. He couldn't promise her that fantasy, but he could promise something else. He gently turned her to face him, looking into those innocent eyes that had seen too much. "Emma," he said softly, "I need you to know something very important." "Did Aunt Rachel come back at all?" Lucas asked, carefully watching his daughter's reaction. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Emma shook her head slowly, her small fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "She said she was going to buy bread, but she never came." Her voice was flat, devoid of the animation that should colour a child's speech. But her eyes glistened with old tears that refused to fall. That was 3 days ago. Lucas felt rage building inside him, a volcano threatening to erupt. His own sister had abandoned his daughter, leaving a 7-year-old to fend for herself. He swallowed hard, pushing down the anger. Emma needed comfort now, not his fury. "You'll never be alone again, sweetheart," he promised, stroking her tangled hair. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." He pulled her close, feeling her thin frame against his chest, her bones too prominent beneath her skin. That night, after Emma had shown him around the apartment that had become more prison than home, Lucas remembered the package of chicken he'd brought from the base. It wasn't much, just some leftover meat from the mess hall that his buddy had wrapped up for him. But it was real food. He found a dusty pan in the kitchen and set about cooking a simple meal. The apartment had electricity, but little else in terms of supplies. As the chicken sizzled in the pan, Emma watched from the doorway, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Is that real meat?" she whispered, as if afraid speaking too loudly might make it disappear. "Yes, baby, real chicken, and tomorrow we'll go shopping for proper groceries." When the meal was ready, they sat together at the small table. Emma ate slowly, savoring each bite. Her gaze softer than it had been all day. Lucas noticed how she carefully chewed each morsel, how she seemed to relax with each passing minute. After dinner, he helped her bathe and put on clean pajamas he found in a drawer. As he tucked her into bed, she looked up at him with those serious eyes. "Are you really staying forever, Daddy?" "Forever and ever," he promised, kissing her forehead. "Nothing could take me away from you again." Sleep came easier for Emma that night, her breathing evening out quickly as exhaustion claimed her. Lucas sat beside her bed for hours, planning their next steps, making mental lists of everything they needed. Tomorrow he would call his commanding officer about extending his leave. Then he would find Rachel and demand answers. But tonight he simply watched over his daughter, guarding her sleep as if it were the most precious duty he had ever been assigned. The next day, Lucas rose before dawn, his determination unwavering despite the sleepless night. He had memorized the address from the envelope he'd found among Emma's things, a faded boarding house in the industrial district. The taxi dropped him off in front of a dilapidated 3-story building with peeling paint and windows covered in yellowed newspaper. A neon vacancy sign flickered half-heartedly in the morning light. The lobby smelled of mildew and cigarettes. A heavy-set man with thinning hair barely looked up from his racing form when Lucas approached the desk. "I'm looking for Rachel Bennett," Lucas said, sliding the envelope across the counter. The landlord's eyes narrowed. "Room 12, back corner, rent's late again." He jerked his thumb toward a dim hallway. "Don't break nothing, I ain't responsible." Lucas's heart hammered as he approached the door. He knocked twice, firmly. Shuffling sounds came from inside, then silence. He knocked again, louder. The door creaked open just enough to reveal Rachel's face, or what remained of it. Her once vibrant features were gaunt, her eyes hollow and ringed with dark circles. Her hair hung limp around her shoulders. When she recognized him, she visibly shrank back. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice a ghost of itself. "I thought you'd never come back." Her words trembled between them. His prepared anger faltered at the sight of her brokenness. This wasn't the villain he'd constructed in his mind, just a lost, broken woman. "You lied to me," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "You left my daughter." Rachel's face crumpled. She stepped back, allowing him inside the sparse room, a mattress on the floor, a single lamp, clothes in piles. "Our daughter," she corrected weakly, then collapsed onto the edge of the mattress, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. "I couldn't do it," she sobbed, guilt and shame pouring out in waves. "I tried, Lucas. I really tried to be what she needed, what you needed. But every day I felt myself disappearing. The walls kept closing in. I couldn't breathe." Her shoulders shook with each ragged breath. "I thought you'd both be better without me." Lucas stood frozen, the speech he'd rehearsed evaporating in the face of her raw confession. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the vibrant, laughing Rachel he'd fallen in love with years ago. Something had consumed her from the inside out, leaving only this fragile shell behind. Lucas sat in silence as Rachel's confession tumbled out between sobs. Her shoulders shook as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not a monster, Lucas. I know that's what you must think of me," she said, wiping tears with the back of her hand. "But I ran away when I should have stayed. I abandoned Emma when she needed me most." "How can anyone forgive that? I can't even forgive myself." Lucas studied her face, searching for the sister-in-law he once knew. The guilt had aged her, carved lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 4 years ago. "Emma still calls you Aunt Rachel," Lucas told her, his voice trembling with emotion. "When she sees your photo, she points and smiles. She remembers you with sadness, not hate." Rachel's eyes widened. "She remembers me?" "Of course she does. You were there for the first 2 years of her life. You were family." Lucas paused, emphasizing the past tense. "You still could be." Rachel shook her head. "I don't deserve that chance." "Maybe not," Lucas admitted. But Emma deserves to know that not everyone leaves her. Some people come back. The weight of his words hung between them. Lucas stood up, suddenly exhausted. This conversation had given him no satisfaction, no closure, only more questions, more complications, yet somehow, amid the confusion, he felt a new resolve forming. "I should go," he said, gathering his jacket. "Emma will be waiting for me at my mother's." Rachel nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Will you tell her you saw me?" Lucas hesitated at the door. "Not yet. I need time to process this, to figure out what's best for her." As he walked to his car, the evening air cool against his face, Lucas realized something important. The past 4 years had been about survival, getting through each day, making sure Emma had what she needed. But maybe it was time to think beyond survival, time to rebuild, no matter how slowly. For Emma's sake, he would try to create something better than mere existence, a real home, a future, and perhaps, when the time was right, a chance to heal old wounds, not for Rachel's sake, but for his daughter's. Home again, Lucas found Emma waiting on the couch, teddy in hand, the afternoon sun painting golden stripes across the faded carpet. She greeted him with a small, hopeful smile, fragile, but real. It was the first genuine expression he'd seen on her face since his return, a tiny breakthrough that made his chest tighten with emotion. "You came back," she whispered, clutching her worn teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, the one he'd given her on her 4th birthday, tighter against her chest. "I promised I would," Lucas replied, setting his keys down on the side table. The house felt different now, less like a battlefield and more like what it truly was, a wounded home in need of healing. Emma patted the empty space beside her. "Can we watch cartoons together, like before?" Lucas crossed the room and sank into the couch, feeling the spring's protest beneath him. The familiar scent of home, a mixture of laundry detergent and the lavender air freshener Sarah always used, wrapped around him like an old friend. "Oh, of course we can, sweetheart." He reached for the remote, noticing the stack of Emma's drawings on the coffee table. The top one showed 3 stick figures holding hands, labeled Daddy, Emma, and Mommy, with wobbly letters. As they settled into a comfortable silence, Emma gradually inched closer until she was leaning against his side. Lucas draped his arm around her tiny shoulders, marveling at how perfectly she still fit there, despite everything that had changed. I'm sorry I got so mad," Emma murmured after a while, her eyes fixed on the colorful characters dancing across the screen. "Mom says sometimes people get mad when they're actually just scared." Lucas swallowed hard. "Your mum is very smart. And you know what? It's okay to be scared sometimes. Were you scared? In the army?" "Yes," he admitted, realizing that truth was the only currency worth trading in now. "Very scared. Sometimes." Emma nodded solemnly, processing this revelation about her father. "I was scared you wouldn't want to be my daddy anymore." Lucas realized then that, despite the wreckage, he was needed, here, now, in this broken place. He closed the front door softly, vowing to never let absence define their lives again. Whatever it took, however long the road ahead, he would rebuild what mattered most: their family, their trust, their love. Starting right here, with cartoon characters and afternoon sunlight. With a little girl who still believed he could make things right. That night, Lucas methodically moved through the house, room by room, erasing all evidence of his months-long absence. The kitchen yielded moldy dishes crusted with unidentifiable substances, some dating back weeks, judging by the fuzzy colonies growing on them. In the living room, damp laundry had been abandoned mid-fold, now carrying a musty odor that permeated everything. Toys lay scattered across the floor, some broken beyond repair, silent witnesses to Emma's lonely play. When he reached Emma's bedroom, his movements slowed. The pink walls seemed faded somehow, matching the dimmed light in his daughter's eyes. Under her bed, partially hidden by a stuffed elephant missing one ear, Lucas found a small notebook with a unicorn cover. Opening it revealed pages of crayon writing, Emma's childish scrawl forming a makeshift diary. "No one came today," read one entry. "The bread is gone. I'm hungry, but Spot shared." Another page simply stated, "The dog is sad. He misses Daddy too." The most recent entry broke him completely. "It's cold. I tried to be brave like Daddy." Lucas sat heavily on her small bed, the springs creaking under his weight. His fingers traced each word, each letter a knife twisting in his heart. Tears burned his eyes as he flipped through pages of Emma's lonely existence. Some entries had crude drawings, stick figures standing alone by empty tables, or huddled with a four-legged shape that must be Spot. These weren't just words, they were wounds. Each crayon stroke represented a silent plea for love, for safety, for someone to care. Lucas realized with crushing clarity that while he'd been fighting imaginary battles with his demons, his daughter had been fighting real ones: hunger, fear, abandonment. He closed the diary and held it against his chest, as if embracing the child who'd written those desperate words. The reality of what Emma had endured, what he had allowed her to endure through his neglect, settled on him like a physical weight. His military training had prepared him for many hardships, but nothing had prepared him for this, seeing the consequences of his failure through the eyes of his innocent child. In a drawer beside Emma's bed, Lucas found a small calendar, its pages worn from handling. Each day was marked with a tiny red heart, a symbol of childish hope that had gradually transformed into disappointment. He flipped through the months, his throat tightening as he realized what they represented. Every single day she had expected him to return. Each heart crossed out when night fell and he hadn't appeared. Some days had tear stains that wrinkled the paper. The most recent page showed hearts that were smaller, fainter, hope diminishing with time. Lucas closed the drawer quietly, his decision crystallizing. That evening, while Emma was watching television with suspicious glances toward the kitchen, he pulled out bread, butter, and cheese. The simple act of cooking felt foreign after years of military mess halls, but his hands remembered. He carefully stacked golden toast and melted cheese on a clean plate. Not a dog bowl, not scraps, but food prepared with intention. When he called her to the table, Emma approached cautiously, her eyes darting between the plate and her father. The suspicion in her gaze cut deeper than any wound he'd received in service. "It's for us," Lucas said, offering a gentle smile. "Real food on real plates, like we used to have." Emma slid into her chair, spine rigid, watching his every movement, as if expecting the normalcy to shatter. She poked at the toast with her finger, testing its reality. Lucas didn't rush her, didn't force conversation. He simply ate his own portion, allowing the comfortable sounds of a shared meal to fill the silence. After several minutes, Emma took a small bite, then another. Each mouthful seemed to relax her shoulders incrementally. By the third bite, she was eating without constantly looking over her shoulder, without hiding food in her pockets for later. "Is it good?" Lucas asked softly. Emma nodded, meeting his eyes briefly before returning to her food. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something, a tiny bridge across the chasm his absence had created. As they sat in the kitchen light, Emma eating without fear for the first time in years, Lucas felt something fragile take root inside him. Not quite happiness, but its quiet precursor. Hope. Hope that with enough patience and consistent love, they might find their way back to being family again. After breakfast, Emma tugged at Lucas's sleeve with a hesitant smile. "Can I draw something?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been the day before. Lucas nodded eagerly, relieved to see this spark of normalcy. He rummaged through his duffel bag and produced a fresh pad of paper and a set of colored pencils he'd purchased at the airport, anticipating moments like this. "Here you go, sweetheart," he said, placing the supplies on the kitchen table. Emma's eyes widened at the pristine paper and vibrant colors, a stark contrast to the scraps she'd been using. Lucas sat beside her, watching as her small hand moved with surprising confidence across the page. Unlike yesterday's dark drawing, this picture featured an open window with golden rays streaming through. Two figures, clearly Emma and himself, stood hand in hand. Though sadness lingered in their sketched expressions, something else shone through, a cautious hope, perhaps, or the first trembling steps toward healing. "That's beautiful," Lucas whispered, throat tight with emotion. Emma nodded, adding a tiny bird perched on the windowsill. While she continued drawing, Lucas's gaze drifted to the wall beside her bed. His heart sank as he noticed a series of small, vertical lines scratched into the paint. Tally marks, he realized with a jolt. 67 marks in total. 67 days of counting, of waiting, of enduring. Curious about what else he might discover, Lucas knelt beside Emma's bed and peered underneath. A shoebox sat in the shadows, its corners worn smooth from handling. He gently pulled it out and lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of bottle caps, arranged by color. Rubber bands knotted together in a chain, smooth pebbles, and scraps of paper with tiny drawings. These weren't just random objects. They were treasures, makeshift toys born of desperation and imagination. "That's my special box," Emma said, suddenly beside him. "Mum said I couldn't have new toys because we needed money for food." Lucas swallowed hard, replacing the lid carefully. "You've been very creative," he managed, fighting back tears. "Very resourceful." Emma shrugged as if it were nothing extraordinary. "Sometimes I pretended the bottle caps were tiny spaceships," she confessed. And the rubber bands could be jump ropes for my paper dolls." Lucas pulled her into a gentle hug, marveling at her resilience while rage burned quietly within him. Children shouldn't need to be this resourceful, this adaptable to neglect. Over Emma's shoulder, he studied the drawing on the table, the sunlight, the open window. Despite everything, his daughter had never stopped believing in brightness, in possibility. "Want to see my drawing too?" he asked. Reaching for a sheet of paper, Emma nodded, and together they bent over the table, adding color to blank pages, building something new from emptiness. "Did you know the dark can talk?" Emma whispered suddenly, her small voice barely audible in the dim kitchen. Her fingers were still clutching Teddy, knuckles white against the worn fur. Lucas blinked, setting down the glass of water he'd been about to offer her. "What do you mean?" he asked gently, trying to keep his voice steady despite the chill that ran down his spine. "When the lights went out, the dark told me no one was coming," she said, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the kitchen wall. "It whispered things, bad things, said Mommy wasn't coming back and you wouldn't either." Her voice trembled as she continued. "Teddy helped me not listen. He covered my ears when it got too scary." Lucas felt his heart fracture. All those nights she'd spent alone in the dark while he was deployed, all those hours she'd spent waiting, believing she'd been abandoned. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to her eye level, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle her. "Emma, sweetheart," he said, cupping her small face between his calloused hands. "The dark lied to you. It was wrong. I'm here now." His thumbs gently wiped away tears she hadn't even realized were falling. "And you'll never have to listen to it alone again, I promise." Emma's eyes, so much like her mother's, filled with fresh tears. For a moment, she just stared at him, searching his face as if looking for proof that he too wouldn't disappear. Then, for the first time since he'd returned home, she threw herself into his arms, a fierce, desperate hug that nearly knocked him backward. Her tiny body shook with sobs against his chest. Her arms locked around his neck with surprising strength. Lucas held her tightly, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other securing her against him. He felt his own tears threatening to spill over. "I was so scared, Daddy," she whispered against his shoulder. "So scared. I know, baby, I know," his voice cracked. "But you were so brave, braver than anyone I've ever met." Emma pulled back slightly, her tear-stained face serious. "Braver than your army friends," Lucas nodded solemnly. "Much braver. They had each other. You just had Teddy." She considered this, then nestled back against him. "And now I have you too. Forever," Lucas promised, knowing with absolute certainty that he would never leave her again. No deployment, no mission, nothing would separate them. The dark would never speak to his daughter again. That night, Lucas sat awake in the dimly lit living room, listening to the gentle rhythm of rain against the roof. Emma had fallen asleep hours ago, exhausted from their emotional day. The pattering droplets reminded him of all the cold, lonely nights his daughter had weathered without him. Nights when she'd resorted to eating dog food just to survive. He glanced at his army uniform draped over the chair in the corner, the fabric still crisp despite years of service. His medals gleamed faintly in the low light, symbols of valor in battles fought far from the one that mattered most. Beside them lay his military ID and a folded message that had arrived yesterday from his commanding officer. "We need you for one more mission." Lucas picked up the paper, reading the words again. 6 months in a foreign desert. Strategic importance. National security. All the phrases that once motivated him now felt hollow compared to the weight of Emma's trust, so fragile and newly rebuilt. He thought about Sandra's addiction, about the system that had failed his daughter, about the neighbors who had looked away. He had fought for strangers halfway across the world while his own child suffered. The irony wasn't lost on him. As dawn broke through the clouds, Lucas had made his decision. He showered, shaved, and put on his full dress uniform for what he knew would be the last time. Emma was still asleep when he left. But he'd prepared her breakfast and left a note. "Be back soon. Promise." This was one promise he intended to keep. The base hummed with morning activity when Lucas arrived. Junior officers saluted him as he walked the familiar path to Colonel Harrington's office. The colonel looked up from his desk, surprise registering on his weathered face at Lucas's formal appearance. "I can't go on the mission, sir," Lucas said, placing his resignation papers on the desk. "And I have a war to fight at home." The colonel started to protest, but something in Lucas's expression stopped him. "My daughter needs me more than the country does right now," Lucas continued, "and I've given enough." As he walked out of the base, a strange mixture of grief and relief washed over him. 15 years of his life left behind. The weight of the decision was bittersweet, like saying goodbye to an old friend. But as he drove back home, where Emma would be waking up, his purpose had never been clearer. Some battles weren't fought with guns and tanks, but with patience, presence, and love. And this was one fight he couldn't afford to lose. Back at home, Emma was playing in the yard, her bare feet caked with mud as she chased after Buddy, the scruffy terrier mix they'd adopted from the shelter 3 months ago. Her laughter, once so rare, now rang through the air like wind chimes, healing something deep in Lucas's chest each time he heard it. He watched from the porch, coffee mug warming his hands, still marveling at how far they'd come since those desperate days in the motel. Rachel visited every other weekend. She moved carefully around them at first, quiet and uncertain of her place, but over time she found ways to help, bringing groceries, reading to Emma, teaching her to braid her hair. The awkwardness between her and Lucas gradually softened into something resembling friendship, bound by their shared love for the little girl who'd survived so much. "Daddy, look what Buddy can do now," Emma called, demonstrating how she'd taught the dog to sit and offer his paw. Lucas applauded, his heart swelling with pride, not just for the trick, but for her resilience, her capacity for joy after everything. In the evenings, Lucas worked in the small shed behind their rented house. He'd built Emma a desk where she could do her homework, a bookshelf for her growing collection of library books, and had spent an entire weekend painting her room in the bright colors she'd chosen. Sunshine yellow and sky blue, his carpentry skills, once just a hobby, had become a steady source of income through commissioned pieces for neighbors and local businesses. Money remained tight. They clipped coupons, bought second-hand clothes, and sometimes worried about making rent. But those worries no longer consumed them. They had enough food, enough warmth, enough love to sustain them through the harder days. The house was small, but it echoed with laughter rather than silence. One evening, Emma tugged at Lucas's hand, leading him to the refrigerator where she'd hung her latest drawing with a magnet shaped like a star. The picture showed their little house bathed in sunlight. 3 figures standing in front, Emma in the middle, Lucas on one side, and a carefully drawn Rachel on the other. Buddy stood nearby, his tail a blur of happy motion. Above them all, she'd written in wobbly letters, "My family." Lucas knelt beside her, throat tight with emotion. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." "Are you crying, Daddy?" Emma asked, touching his cheek. "Happy tears," he explained, pulling her close. "Because we're home now." Really home. And they were, not just in a physical place, but in the love they'd fought for, lost and finally found again.